Thanks for joining us tonight for the first in our series of lectures on understanding Varroa mites. So there are going to be 3 more lectures after this in the next 2 weeks. So keep your eye out for those as well. So my name is Glenys Robinson, and I am a research technician, forgot the word for a second there, for the Ontario Beekeepers Association Technology Transfer Program. So today we are going to take a deep dive into the impacts that Varroa mites have on honeybee colonies. So I think beekeepers all understand that Varroa mites are a very serious and very pervasive honeybee pest. But I think some of the ways that they can actually impact our colonies can seem a little bit mysterious. So we are going to get into the nitty-gritty of Varroa mites, their biology, their life cycles, and the specific ways that they actually impact our colonies. So Varroa mites, here we go. So the scientific name for Varroa mites is Varroa destructor, and that gives us our first clue as to just how serious of a threat these pests are to our colonies. So just a little bit of background information. So Varroa mites are arachnids, so they're related to things like spiders and ticks. They are obligate parasites of Western honeybee colonies. So that means that they can't really survive for very long without honeybee colonies. They need them to feed as well as to reproduce. They are also ectoparasites, which means that they feed on honeybees, so both on the adults and the brood, from the outside. Ecto means outside or external. So they're more like something like a tick or a mosquito than something like a tapeworm. Varroa mites are the biggest single threat to honeybee health globally. It's really, really important to understand that if they are left untreated, they will kill a colony in a matter of seasons. So it might not be that first season, but that second or third season, it will for sure kill the colony. So definitely a really big threat to honeybee health. It may not be the first thing that you think of when you think of overwinter bee problems, but research has actually shown that Varroa mites are the #1 cause of overwinter colony mortality in Ontario. So we will dive into the reasons for that in a second, but I do just want to take a minute in case there are people tuning in from outside of Ontario, just to remind you that different provinces have different regulations and recommendations for different pests and different treatments. So just be aware that we are talking about everything today from an Ontario perspective. All right, so in this picture, the Varroa mite on the left, the big red one, that is a female. And the Varroa mite on the right, that little white one, is actually a male if you haven't seen a male before. So just keep these in mind as we go through the next part so you can have something to picture as we go through it. All right, so how does the Varroa mite life cycle work? How do the Varroa mites develop and reproduce? So it's really important to remember that Varroa mites reproduce exclusively under capped brood. So to start this process off, a female mite will enter a brood cell just before it gets capped over by the worker bees. And she'll hide at the bottom of the cell so the worker bees don't notice that she is there and remove her. And it's just a little note that we often refer to these female mites, these reproductive females, as the foundress. So once the cell is capped over, the foundress, she will come out of hiding and she will start feeding on the prepupa. So in order to do that, she actually makes a wound in the prepupa's cuticle, so it's kind of outer layer there, and she'll keep it open and continue to feed from this wound. She will also start to lay eggs. So the first egg that she lays is always going to be male, and then every egg that she lays after that will always be a female. So those eggs will hatch, and the young mites, they will hang out in the brood cell and they will feed on the pupa and they will grow and develop. And then once they reach sexual maturity, the daughters will mate with that one male mite. And then the adult bee will emerge from the cells when it's all grown up and ready to join the colony. And when the bee emerges, all of the female mites, so including that first foundress mite, all the mature female mites will leave the cell with the bee, and they will go and they will find other brood cells to infest and start the cycle all over again. So the male mite and any immature females, so any females that haven't reached sexual maturity, they will stay in the cell and they will die there. So you won't see the male or these immature females on adult bees. When they are not reproducing in capped cells, the adult females, they will move around the colony. They can attach themselves to adult bees, and they will feed on these adult bees and use them to move around and find new brood cells to infest. So we call this the phoretic stage, which basically means the travel stage. So I do want to point out, because it's really important, that because the brood cells are where they reproduce, that means that when brood is present in the colony, 50 to 90% of the Varroa mite population will be under the cappings. So the vast majority will be under the cappings. So that's why you might not be seeing that many mites on bees, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. They're there under the cappings, and they are multiplying. So that's just something that it is really important to always be aware of. So this picture shows two female mites. So it is important to note that more than one foundress can infest a cell at the same time. So you'll have multiple foundresses at once in severe infestations. And then that little white one is the mite. So you can see, the male mite. So you can see that the male is a lot smaller than the females, and it will always be white. It's never going to turn red. And this picture, you can compare. The white one in this picture is an immature female. So she starts off white and then she darkens to red as she matures. And you can see she is bigger than the little male, and she's also kind of a different shape. So that's how you can tell the difference. All right, so you may have heard that Varroa mites prefer drone brood, and that is absolutely correct. A lot of people will sometimes tell you that that is because drone cells are bigger, so the Varroa mites have more space. It's not actually about the amount of space, it's about the amount of time that drones take to develop. So you can see from this chart that drones, they actually take about 3 days longer than workers to develop to maturity. And it's really important to note that most of that extra time is during the pupal stage. And that is, of course, the stage where the cell is capped over and the mites are reproducing underneath. So that little bit of extra time may not seem like a really big deal, but it actually is, because it allows more daughter mites to reach maturity, so they will survive and they will enter the colony and they will also start reproducing. So in worker brood, one foundress will successfully have 1 to 2 daughter mites who survive till adulthood. But in drone brood, one female mite will have 2 to 3 daughters who can survive until adulthood. And that makes a big difference. It's also important to count the foundress mite, that first mother mite, in the in your counts of female mites that are exiting and going on to reproduce. So a female mite is not limited to one reproductive cycle. She will have, on average, 3 to 4 reproductive cycles in her lifetime. So that is a lot of offspring. It's really important to understand that Varroa mite populations grow exponentially. So if we think about kind of the highest range of average offspring that they can have, that means that one foundress mite in her lifetime can produce about 12 daughters, and then each of those daughters can have the potential to go on to produce 12 of their own daughters. So really the population, it just kind of starts to snowball. So unless you are going to intervene with a chemical treatment, that means that the longer amount of time that passes, the more mites you will have in a colony. So it's really important to bear in mind that they do grow exponentially. There are some impacts on honeybee reproduction that you can see when there is a severe Varroa mite infestation. So the mites feeding on drones can result in drones that are stunted and weak, and these drones won't survive till sexual maturity, or if they do, they will have lower reproductive success. So that means that Varroa mite parasitism can definitely lead to reduced reproductive success in honeybees. Another thing that's important to note is that high infestations can also lead to the supersedure of queens. So that is when the colony tries to replace the queen because they think that she's failing. So that is not the ideal situation, certainly something that we want to avoid. So what does it actually look like when you have a severe Varroa mite infestation? So when colonies are crashing from Varroa mites, they will show a bunch of symptoms which are collectively known as parasitic mite syndrome, or PMS. And it's important to realize that a lot of these symptoms on their own are usually indicative of a different problem. So for example, brood disease. It's when you're seeing a bunch of these symptoms all together that you're probably looking at PMS. So just important to be aware of the context. So one of the things that you might potentially see is a spotty brood pattern. So this is something that you would usually see with maybe brood disease or a failing queen, but in this case, it's just the result of the fact that a lot of brood that is being reared under these conditions is not actually going to survive till adulthood. So you can start to see a spotty brood pattern. Another symptom that you might see is deformed wing virus. So this is a honeybee virus that we are going to talk much more about later on in this presentation, but it has really distinctive symptoms. So you'll see bees with these deformed, shriveled wings. They can't fly, they can only crawl around on the combs. And again, we're going to talk about this later, but I do really want to emphasize that if you're seeing bees with deformed wings, that is a really clear sign that you have a severe Varroa infestation. That's a sign that you have very high Varroa levels in your colony. Another symptom that you can see is dying or deflated larvae. So this can look really similar to a brood disease called European foul brood, but in this case, it's not caused by a pathogen. It's caused by the fact that there aren't enough worker bees to take care of the brood that's left. So larvae are really, really dependent on worker bees or nurse bees to take care of them. They can't survive without them. So you'll often end up seeing these really kind of unhealthy or dying larvae just because they're not being taken care of. So we often call this snot brood, which is really charming, but it It's kind of yellowy and slimy and snotty looking. Um, so it's when these larvae aren't getting cared for properly that we end up seeing snot brood. It mentions here in the slide that snot brood doesn't cause ropiness. So brood diseases like American foul brood or European foul brood, they will cause ropiness. So what that means is you can do kind of a little test where you can take a stick or a toothpick and you can put it in a cell with sketchy brood. You can swirl it around, and then when you slowly pull the stick out of the cell, the larval remains will kind of rope out, kind of like mozzarella cheese. So snot brood, because there's no bacteria there, it won't actually do this. So that's kind of a way that you can tell snot brood apart from a different brood disease. Another thing that you might see are sunken perforated brood cappings. So brood cappings that have little holes in them where the workers have been chewing on them. Again, this is something that you will often see in cases of brood disease. But in this case, again, it's just because there's a lot of brood that isn't making it to adulthood. So it's not because there's a disease, it's just because it's dead or dying under the cappings. Another thing that you can see is bald, uncapped pupae that are dead. So if you've ever seen bald pupae as a result of wax moths, so when you have wax moth larvae tunneling through the combs, this can also cause pupae to be uncapped, and you'll see their little faces poking out, and you're not supposed to see that. They should be under the cappings. So if it's wax moth, then the pupae that are uncapped, they'll still look pretty healthy, and you'll also see them close to the silky webbing that wax moth larvae leave behind. But in the case of PMS, the pupae, they will look unhealthy. They'll be kind of a little bit off-colored and dead-looking, and you also won't see that webbing or those signs of wax moth. Like I already mentioned, you can see queen supersedure. And one last thing that you will often notice is a dwindling bee population. So again, if all of that brood isn't necessarily making it till adulthood, then you're going to have a smaller adult bee population. And it's important to remember that with a small adult bee population, there won't be enough bees to go out and get enough food to feed the brood. So it's all kind of interconnected. Just to give you an idea, in the top left picture, that is a bee with those really hallmark wings that are characteristic of deformed wing virus. So if you've ever seen a bee with wings like this, that is deformed wing virus. On the top right, you have an example of a spotty brood pattern. So again, in this situation, in the situation of PMS, the queen will be laying eggs, but those larvae aren't going to make it till adulthood because there just aren't enough adult bees to take care of them. So they'll end up getting removed by the workers, and you'll see this spotty brood pattern. On the bottom left, those are those dead pupae that are uncapped or bald. So again, under normal circumstances, you shouldn't be able to see pupae. They should always be capped over. And these ones you can see look pretty unhealthy. On the bottom right, we have those dying deflated larvae, aka snot brood, like I mentioned. So it does look kind of like European foul brood, but again, if you're seeing it together with all of these other symptoms, then it's a pretty good sign that it's Varroa mites. And you can also do that ropiness test just to rule out the possibility of brood disease. All right, so we have already mentioned that Varroa mites feed both on adult bees and developing pupa, but what exactly is it that they are eating? So if you have read a textbook or an article that was written before 2019, it will tell you that they are feeding on the bee's hemolymph, which is the insect equivalent of blood. But But we now know, thanks to new research by Dr. Samuel Ramsey in 2019, that they actually don't feed on the hemolymph. What they feed on is the fat body. So if you thought the answer to this question was hemolymph, that's okay. Basically, the whole world did until very recently. All right. So the fat body is a collection of tissues that is located in the abdomen. So that's the bee's butt. And it is located on both the dorsal and ventral sides of the abdomen, just under the exoskeleton. So I couldn't really find a great picture of a real fat body to show you, so I just made this little graphic just to give you an idea of where it would be located within the bee. So we often like to say that the fat body is kind of like the bee equivalent of a liver, but that's a little bit of an oversimplification. The fat body is just an incredibly multifaceted organ. It has a lot of very diverse, very important functions for the bee. So these functions include internal energy storage. So we'll talk about this more in a minute, but this energy storage is really, really important for the bees to be able to overwinter properly. It also is important for metabolism, which is basically the way that the body converts food into energy. It's really important for hormone regulation, which is, of course, very essential to a whole bunch of different processes that take place in the bee's body. And really, really importantly, it is critical for the bee's immune response. So it can, we'll talk about this in a second, but it can really weaken their immune response and make them more susceptible to other issues. And kind of related to that, it's really important for pesticide detoxification. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Oops, skipped a slide there, sorry. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about immune function. So this might not be something that you have ever really thought about before, but insects do have immune systems. So they have what is called an innate immune system. So an innate immune system, it's kind of a less advanced version of an immune system. So it's not quite as advanced as our own. It can't target, it can't recognize pathogens that it has already encountered and and target them specifically, but it can realize that there are foreign bodies present and be like, hey, you don't belong here. And it can launch both cellular responses and humoral responses to these foreign bodies to help neutralize the threat. So cellular responses, they are responses that include immune cells that kind of physically respond to the foreign bodies or pathogens. And then humoral responses involve the secretion of different factors, so like antimicrobial peptides and other things like that. An antimicrobial peptide is kind of like, it's kind of like an antibiotic that the body can produce itself, is a good way to think about it. So it's really important to remember that the fat body is the bee's main immune organ. So if it gets damaged by Varroa mites, then that is really going to affect the bee's overall immune system and their overall ability to respond to these threats. So Varroa parasitism results in decreased production of various essential immune factors. So for example, it decreases the production of antimicrobial peptides. So again, those kind of natural antibiotics. It reduces the production of hemocytes, which are immune cells that are part of the cellular immune response. And it also decreases the production of something called vitellogenin. So vitellogenin is, well, it has a lot of functions, but the one that's important to this conversation right now is that it's an antioxidant. So basically, it reduces oxidative stress, which helps to prolong the bee's lifespan. So that was all a whole bunch of words, but what I'm trying to say here is that Varroa parasitism, it basically stops the bees from being able to produce these things that are really essential for their immune responses. So basically, the bee's immune system, it won't work properly. It'll make them more susceptible to other pathogens and stressors. So basically, we can consider parasitized bees to be immunocompromised. They just won't have a functioning immune system. All right, so loosely related to this is pesticide detoxification. So the fat body is also the organ that is responsible for pesticide detoxification. And that is kind of the main reason why we compare it to the liver, because the liver is also responsible for detoxifying chemicals. So just to be clear, the picture here is of a human liver. It is not anything that can be found in a bee. Bees don't have anything like this. And I just wanted to bring up a recent study that found that that bee colonies that had unmanaged Varroa infestations were a lot more susceptible to 5 different pesticides that they tested compared to colonies that had Varroa infestations that were managed with chemical treatments. So these 5 different pesticides, they came from 5 different classes of insecticides. So basically, they were kind of to give a representative sample of a bunch of different types of pesticides. And that's why these 5 were chosen. So this study just goes to show that Varroa mites can really worsen the impact of other stressors because they are reducing that immune response as well as reducing the bee's ability to detoxify pesticides as well as it normally could. All right, so moving along with immunity, we're going to talk about the relationship between Varroa mites and viruses. Just a little bit of background is there are a whole bunch of different honeybee viruses that impact bees globally. And there are a whole bunch of different ways that these viruses are transmitted. So they can be transmitted through contaminated feed. They can be transmitted when an infected queen passes it along to an egg. But one of the most significant ways that these viruses can be transmitted is through Varroa mites. So Varroa mites are considered to be a vector for many of these honeybee viruses. So that means they don't cause the virus, they don't create the virus, but they can pass the virus from host to host, kind of in the same way that a tick can spread Lyme disease. So it's important to understand that in most cases, a lot of these viruses are kind of latent in the colony. So that means that they're there, but not at levels that really cause any damage until they are exposed to other stressors as well. And guess what is a great example of a stressor? Varroa mites. So in the presence of Varroa mites, viruses can have really severe impacts on bee health. So it's kind of important to look at the ways that Varroa mites and viruses work together. They do such damage, these viruses, as a result of Varroa mites, that it's actually believed that a lot of the negative impacts we see from Varroa mites come from the viruses that they spread, not from damage to the mites not damage done by the mites themselves. So the mites are doing damage, but it's maybe not that significant compared to the damage of these viruses that they're spreading. Another thing that it's important to realize is that many of these viruses can actually replicate inside the mites. So they're not just being spread by the mites. Once they're inside the mites' bodies, they can actually start to multiply there. So the presence of Varroa mites is actually increasing the overall levels of viruses that are found within these colonies. Like we just mentioned, feeding by Varroa mites weakens the bees' immune systems. So it makes the bees more susceptible to these viruses. So it's kind of a perfect storm where not only are the viruses being transmitted, but they're being transmitted to bees who already are struggling with their immune responses. So they're much more likely to become infected by these viruses. And something that's really, really important to understand is that virus levels persist even after the Varroa population is controlled. So if you have high Varroa levels, even if you kill them off with chemical treatments, they will still have done lasting damage by transmitting these viruses to the brood. So even after you get rid of the Varroa mites, the viruses stick around if they've already been transmitted. Just to further illustrate this, I just wanted to briefly bring up this study by Francis et al. So they wanted to look at the viral loads that were in both bees and Varroa mites under 3 different treatment conditions over the course of a year. And specifically, the viruses that they were looking at are deformed wing virus and what is called the AKI complex. So the AKI complex is basically a group of 3 different viruses that are very closely related. So these viruses are the acute bee paralysis virus, the Kashmir bee virus, and the Israeli acute paralysis virus. So basically, these 3 viruses are very closely related. So we kind of end up studying them together because they're so closely related. So the study found that there is a clear trend of rising virus levels in bee populations from spring to autumn, which is not surprising because that, of course, parallels the increasing Varroa mite populations. They also found that colonies that died during the course of the study, they had higher prevalence of both deformed wing virus and the AKI complex during the months of September and October. And again, that's not very surprising because that is right around when the Varroa population in a colony has peaked, or kind of right after it's peaked. But the most important thing that they found is that in many cases, even when they did treatments and they tested 3 different types of treatments, well, technically 2 because 1 was the control, so no treatment. So they found that in many cases, treatment resulted in no significant reduction in the prevalence of infected bees. So that is just like I said, even if you get rid of the Varroa mites with chemical treatments, those viruses will persist. The effects of those Varroa mites will stick around even after you have controlled them. While we are on the subject of honeybee viruses, I want to spend a little bit more time on deformed wing virus. Deformed wing virus is a really great example of all the things that we're talking about because it's highly, highly associated with Varroa levels, and also because it's something that a lot of beekeepers have probably already seen in their own hives. So just to reiterate, like I said before, if you're seeing deformed wing virus, that is a very clear indication that you have high Varroa levels in your colony. So I already mentioned that the telltale symptom of deformed wing virus is those shriveled, crumpled wings, but it can also cause decreased body size as well as a shortened lifespan. It's also a really good example of a virus that can replicate within the mite. So again, it's not just surviving within the mite, it's replicating, it's multiplying. So the presence of Varroa mites is actually increasing the levels of virus within the colony. Also, something that's really interesting is that some researchers consider the relationship between deformed wing virus and Varroa mites to be a symbiotic relationship. So what that means is that it's a relationship that is mutually beneficial for both the mite and the virus. So the ways that the mite benefits the virus are pretty obvious because the mite is really essential for both the transmission and replication of the virus. But how does the virus benefit the mites? So research by DePrisco et al., it found that deformed wing virus itself actually has an immunosuppressive effect on the bee. So what that means is that the virus itself, not just the damage by the mites, is reducing the bee's immune system's ability to function. So it's kind of like a vicious circle. The mite benefits the virus, and the virus benefits the mite. So they both help each other to flourish, and then they both have really harmful effects on the bee. So again, the mites and the viruses, their relationship is kind of about them working together to damage the bee, if you want to think about it like that. Okay, so really briefly, I just want to bring up the fact that there are no chemical treatments that exist for honeybee viruses. So the best way to prevent viruses in your colonies is actually to control your Varroa mites. And the only way to do that is to monitor routinely and then to treat appropriately based on the results of your monitoring. So I'm not going to get into monitoring. I'm not going to get into treatments. Colette's talk on Thursday is all about monitoring, and then Dan's talk next Tuesday is all about treatments. So if those are subjects that you want to learn more about, definitely tune in for those two talks. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and start to talk about the ways that Varroa mites affect the bee's ability to overwinter. But before we do that, we have to understand the difference between summer bees and winter bees. So summer bees are worker bees that are raised in the spring or summer in order to do summer tasks. So like foraging and honey production and that kind of thing. Winter bees are, you guessed it, workers that are raised for the winter in order to do winter tasks. And the most important thing to understand is that these winter bees are actually physiologically different from summer bees. So that means that they have physical differences that allow them to function differently. So these physical differences include an enlarged hypopharyngeal gland. So the hypopharyngeal gland is a gland in the worker's head where she produces royal jelly. They also have enlarged fat bodies. So remember we talked about fat bodies are really important for internal energy storage. So it's kind of similar to the way that a hibernating bear has more fat stores in order to survive the winter. Again, it's just extra energy stores that help the bees survive the winter. It's not really a physical difference, but winter bees are also less active. So they do work over the winter. Mostly they maintain the hive temperature, but it's less taxing on them than brood production, which isn't happening over the winter. So these differences, they result in longer lifespans for the winter bees. So summer bees usually live for around 6 weeks. They work really hard and they don't live that long. And then winter bees, because of these differences, can live for up to 6 months, which is a huge difference, of course. So these differences are really important because they allow the colony to survive the winter without any brood production. All right, so where do Varroa mites come into this? So these winter bees, they start to be produced in late summer or early fall, so usually around August. And that is also when the Varroa mite population is reaching its peak. So the bee population peaks earlier in the summer. So by this point, there are fewer bees and less brood in the colony. So that means that you have lots and lots of mites parasitizing way fewer bees. So you're going to have a lot more damage from these mites. And we already talked about brood that is parasitized by Varroa. It will develop into bees that are small, weak, immunocompromised. They're just not very healthy and they have shorter lifespans. And that is really, really critical when you need this population of winter bees in order to survive in order to allow the colony to survive for the whole winter. So it's really important that we keep these winter bees healthy. If these winter bees become infected with viruses, they'll have shortened lifespans. They will not really be able to contribute properly to the colony. And as a result, the colony is way less likely to survive the winter. So again, just to reiterate, if you have high Varroa levels in the fall, even if you get them back under control using chemical treatments, they will already have damaged the winter bee population by weakening them and transmitting viruses. Switching gears a little bit here. So Varroa mites do have an impact on honey production, but it's a little bit complicated because it all depends on the timing. So this can be really deceptive and people can get a little bit confused because often people's best honey producers, the colonies that produce the most honey, they end up crashing in the fall due to Varroa mites. So that's a really common scenario. We hear from beekeepers all the time where they had these colonies that were booming, they were super strong, they were bringing in all this honey, so of course they assumed they were healthy, and then they ended up crashing in the late summer or early fall. So there is a reason for this. So strong colonies are going to have higher Varroa levels because they're producing more brood. And as we learned, Varroa mites need brood in order to reproduce. So that's a really important thing to understand, is that the stronger the colony, the more Varroa mites you are going to have because of that booming brood production. So basically what I'm trying to say is that if you have low Varroa levels starting in the spring, then it's possible for you to end up having a really, really great honey crop, and then either that colony crashes, you lose the colony, or those Varroa mite levels stay really high over the winter, and then they start in the spring really high. And if mite levels are already high in the spring, then honey production is going to suffer. Those mites are going to start impacting the worker bees earlier, and without healthy worker bees, or with a dwindling worker bee population, you're just not going to have a very good honey crop. So the timing of the infestation and the strength of the infestation is what is going to influence that impact on honey production. Okay, so full disclosure, I am not an economist, and even if I was, it would be really complicated to really specifically quantify the impacts of Varroa mites on the financial impacts of Varroa mites. But I did want to bring it up in kind of general terms because it really is undeniable that Varroa mites do lead to financial losses, and it's important to understand that. So these financial losses can either come from decreased honey production, like we just talked about. For a lot of beekeepers, this is a really big deal. Your honey is your whole livelihood. It's your bread and butter. Or these losses can come from colony mortality as a result of Varroa mites. So colonies that die and you end up needing to replace them. But something else that I want to bring up is that if you have invested in good genetics, so if you have bought queens from breeders specifically because you wanted their genetic traits, so whether it was honey production or gentleness or anything like that, if you lose that queen either because the colony dies because of Varroa mites or because the colony supersedes because of Varroa mites, then you're losing that investment in your genetics. And that can be a big deal if you've been working on those genetics and investing in it over, seasons and seasons, years and years. You don't want to lose that. Another thing to think about is that colonies die of Varroa mites at the end of the season, so usually in fall or early winter. So at that point, you've already put a lot of time and money and effort into getting these colonies through the season. So depending on where it is in the season, you have probably already fed for the fall, and you may even have already treated for Varroa mites. So it is possible to put on chemical treatments and have them just not be effective, whether they went on too late or they were used incorrectly or there's resistance happening. There's a bunch of different factors that influence that. So just think about all of the money that went into buying those Varroa treatments, as well as the time and labor that went into putting it on. So just overall, the point I'm trying to make is it is a big loss when you think about everything that you have put into these colonies all through the season to lose them at the end of the season. Okay, so how do Varroa mites spread? So there are a whole bunch of different ways that they can spread. So they can spread through migratory beekeeping, where hives are being trucked around to different locations for crop pollination. They can be spread by frame movement between beekeepers. Of course, this is, a necessary practice in beekeeping, but it's important to realize that if you're not careful, it can have some impacts in terms of pests and diseases. They can spread through the movement of swarms. So when bees swarm, they will leave the brood behind, and they'll leave all of the mites that are in the brood behind, but they will take the phoretic mites, so the mites that are in that traveling stage, they'll bring them with them. They'll carry them on their bodies. This is a big one. They can also spread through the robbing of weak hives. So if a colony has a weak population, they won't be able to defend the hive very well, and workers from healthy colonies, they're going to come and they are going to rob the food stores from these weak hives. There's also a certain amount of kind of natural drift between from workers and drones moving between colonies. Sometimes bees just don't know exactly which hive they came from, and they end up accidentally going back to a different hive beside the one that they came from. And it's also possible for Varroa mites to be transferred at shared food and water sources. So that includes feed barrels and flowers and water sources that are attracting bees from multiple colonies. So the main takeaway here is that there's a lot more intermingling going on with bees from outside of your operation than you might think. So it's really important to recognize that if you are not managing your Varroa mites properly, you're not just affecting your own colonies, but you're also impacting colonies in a pretty wide radius around you. Sometimes people refer to untreated hives as mite bombs. So that's because as the colony is crashing, it's kind of like it explodes and it launches Varroa mites into nearby colonies like shrapnel. And what I mean by launch is either mite-infested bees will drift from these dying colonies that they're trying to get away from into healthy colonies, or bees from healthy colonies will come and rob out these Varroa weakened colonies. So there's a lot of kind of physical contact and intermingling. There's a lot of fighting between bees when there's robbing. So those phoretic mites, they'll end up attaching themselves to the robber bees who will take them home with them. Another thing that's really important to consider is that here in Ontario, we have a super high colony density. We are all basically on top of each other. OMAFRA, what was their number? For 2021, they said that we had just over 102,000 colonies in Ontario. And those are just the colonies that are being reported, the registered colonies. So who's to say how many unregistered colonies there are, but I'd be willing to bet there are a lot. So basically, even if you don't think you do, even if you haven't seen them, the chances are very, very high in Ontario that you have neighboring bees within a radius that they can intermingle with your own colonies. So that's why it's really, really important that we all are doing the best that we can to manage our Varroa mites. It sounds really corny to say, but we are all in this together. Another reason that it's important to manage our Varroa levels is because it is possible for our Varroa mites to also impact native pollinators. So Varroa mites, they can't reproduce on other pollinator species, but they can attach to the bodies of these other insects when they're in the phoretic stage. So they have been found on a whole bunch of different types of native bees, as well as pollinating wasps and pollinating flies. So just for a little bit of background, honeybees are not actually native to North America, but there are at least 400 species of bees that are native to Ontario. And there's also tons and tons of different native wasps and flies, many of which are also pollinators. So some of these native bees are social, so for example, things like bumblebees, and then some are solitary, so like the cute little gray bee that's in that top picture there. So basically, there are a whole bunch of different types of bees, as well as other insects. So that stripy guy in the bottom picture there, it kind of looks like a bee, but it is actually a hoverfly. So it's a type of fly that is trying to imitate a bee to protect itself from predators. So all of these other insects, they also have a very important ecological role. So if you're wondering how the mites can spread to these other insect species, it's usually at shared flowers. So research has shown that the mites can actually hop off of bees that bring them to flowers, hang out on the flower for a little bit, and then hop on to other bees that come to forage from that flower. So to be clear, the concerns aren't so much about Varroa mites becoming parasites of these other species. They're more about pathogen spillover. So the spread of pathogens like viruses to these different host populations. So many honeybee viruses have been detected in native bees, but it's not really clear how these viruses actually impact them. So this is definitely an area that needs a little bit more research to get to the bottom of things. But overall, managing our Varroa mites is really important for also protecting native pollinators. I know a lot of people get into beekeeping, myself included, because they care about pollinators, they care about the environment. So I know no one wants to accidentally be doing damage to these native pollinator populations. Really quickly, I just want to go over this case study in Hawaii because it's a really great example of Varroa mites and pathogen spillover. So pretty much everywhere in the world has Varroa mites except for some islands that have managed to prevent the spread. So one of these islands is Maui in Hawaii. But another island in Hawaii, Oahu, it does have Varroa mites. So this basically gives us the perfect research setting to see how much of an impact Varroa has on spreading these pathogens to other species. So what they did is they tested deformed wing virus levels in honeybees as well as 3 other related insect species on both islands so they could compare. So in case you're curious, the other insect species were 1 species of carpenter bee and 2 different species of social wasps. And they did find a much higher incidence of deformed wing virus in both honeybees and these other related species in Oahu, which is the island that is Varroa positive, compared to Maui, which is Varroa negative and had very, very low levels of deformed wing virus. So this does go to show that Varroa mites can really cause problems in terms of pathogen spillover or viral spillover. All right, so all I have left to say are a few take-home messages just to sum everything up. So going all the way back to the beginning of that presentation, it's important to remember that the majority of mites are under the brood cappings. So even if you can't see them, they are there and they are multiplying. And it's important to remember that the more brood you have in a colony, so the stronger the colony making more brood, the more Varroa mites you're going to have. Also, just to recap, Varroa feeding damages the fat body, which ends up having really diverse negative impacts on honeybee health. So it causes weak, stunted, immunocompromised bees with shortened lifespans. In turn, these negative health effects will have financial consequences for your operation, whether it's in the form of lost honey profits or from having to replace colonies that have died due to Varroa mites. Also really important to remember that Varroa parasitism, it reduces the bees' overwintering ability. So it's really important if we want our bees to do well over the winter that we get Varroa levels under control before winter bee production in order to prevent them from spreading these viruses. Like I mentioned, the best way to prevent viruses is actually to control your Varroa mites. Again, there are no chemical treatments, so in this case, the best offense is a good defense. And the last thing that I always want everyone to remember is that whether you have seen them or not, whether you're aware of them, the odds in Ontario that you have neighbors are very, very overwhelmingly likely. Whether these neighbors are other honeybees or native pollinators, it's important to remember that we aren't beekeeping in a vacuum. Our actions affect others, and we can also be affected by the actions of others. So it's really important that we are always monitoring and treating appropriately. Okay, so that was a whole lot of information. I am almost done talking. I will take questions if you have any, but I do just want to remind you that, again, I didn't really go into the topics of monitoring or treatments or resistance traits. So if you have questions about those, maybe save them for the upcoming presentations because we didn't really get into that today.